Hi everyone, welcome to week 8 of Ethics Professional Practice. This week we look at ethical decision making process. We also look at confidentiality, informed consent, and exceptions to confidentiality. What I'll do is the lecture is split into two parts, and this is primarily done for the purpose of uploading the lectures onto YouTube. The slide contents remains the same. I advise you to download the slides and listen to the lectures while you are going through the slide material. I'll also be making reference to last week's content as well, so I advise you to download the slides from last week as well. So last week we looked at introduction to ethics. We looked at ethics, values, and morals. We looked at definition of ethical theories and ethical dilemmas. We looked at code of ethics. In particular, we looked at ACWA ASW code of ethics and importance of ethical standards. If you have any questions regarding last week's content, I advise you to speak with your lecturers through the tutorial chat portal. I'll just briefly touch on the codes of ethics again, just to help you to refresh. Various professional associations, for example, counseling, social work, psychiatry, psychology, community services, other human service industries have established code of ethics. They provide a broad guidelines for the practitioner. When we looked at code of ethics last week, we looked at in particular ACWA and ASW. These are national organizations or national professional organizations that have similarities. They also have differences as well. In addition to the national professional associations such as ACWA, ASW, APS, industry associations have also developed code of ethics as well. But the code of ethics is specific to that profession. And when you look at Australian context, all state regulatory authorities, state regulatory boards have their own code of ethics and professional practice guidelines as well. I advise you to go onto ASW ACWA website and look at the professional guidelines. We have uploaded the code of ethics onto the portal in section 7 of your Moodle portal. So when you look at your code of ethics, there are certain common themes as well. As said before, social work and community service associations have their own code of ethics. And I advise you to familiarize with that as well. And when you're familiarizing with it, you'll notice that they have certain themes. Now, what are these themes? They are to promote the welfare of the clients. They're practicing within the scope of one's competence. They're about doing no harm. The codes talk about protecting clients' confidentiality. The codes also talk about protecting clients' privacy. Codes talk about acting ethically and responsibly in our profession. Codes talk about avoiding exploitation. Codes also talk about upholding integrity of the profession by striving towards aspirational practice. Now, in Australia, it's our responsibility to follow the code of ethics. We can't plead ignorance on the specifics of code of ethics. No court of law in Australia is going to accept that as an excuse for any unethical behavior. So once again, I advise you to go through the code of ethics, refresh yourself with the principles. Now I'll talk about limitations as well, just briefly on code of ethics. You know, your own ethical awareness, your own problem-solving skills as well will determine how you implement various code of ethics into professional behaviors. as I said last week, these codes are not prescriptive. These codes are not written in stones. They're not cookbooks. They just provide guidelines on what to do and what not to do. They provide guidelines on ethical decision-making process as well, which we're going to look at this week. And from my experience, ACWA ASW members are increasingly facing difficult ethical dilemmas in complex and dynamic society that we live in. And simple and direct application of code may not be possible. And also, we need to acknowledge as well that there might be some differences of opinion as well between members on how ethical principles and values should be ranked as well. When you look at your week 1 activity, we talked about ranking your personal values as well. And the same thing can apply to a professional context as well. So one of the things I would advise you is to reflect and develop a high level of ethical judgment as well in your role. So now we're going to look at ethical decision-making process. It's an important part of your role. So I advise you to look at the relevant textbook chapter and reflect on what ethical decision-making process is. So we'll talk about range of decision-making procedures and how you're going to employ them in your role, or how you're going to employ the appropriate models as well in making ethical decisions. Now, in community services, ethical action require you to prepare, assess the dilemma, implement a decision or make a decision and implement a decision, and then reflect on the decision-making process. Going back to ethical dilemma, we looked at it last week. Ethical dilemma happens when our internal basis or when our views clash with another. For an individual, this can happen when a situation forces the person into choosing between two competing personal moral concepts. So when that happens in your work, when that happens in your role, it's advisable to talk about it with another person or another colleague or a supervisor for clarity and direction. But when your views come in conflict with others or an organization, the situation becomes more complex. So, when different people who have particular personal, professional roles and interests, and they have a multitude of perspectives on what should be done in a difficult situation, we need an ethical decision-making process. So we'll talk about some of the complex questions that may arrive when you're working in community services. Decision-making process will also help you with any ethical dilemmas that you have personally confronted with, or in your role in community services. So we'll talk about various models of decision-making process, and your Moodle tutorial activities will provide case studies that'll bring life examples from community services. So before we go into ethical decision-making model, let's look at what ethical decision-making is. An ethical decision-making is a process that involves recognizing that there is an ethical problem and finding a solution that best suits the situation. There are a number of ways to make an ethical decision, and we'll describe a few in this week's lecture. Um, and we also advise you to research on your own ethical decision-making models as well. So we'll start with your prescribed model in the textbook. So the inclusive model of ethical decision-making by McAuliffe and Chenoweth. So the model you're seeing here has 5 steps that the authors have identified. When you refer to the textbook chapter, the caveat also says that that some of the steps can be only applied when the situation warrants them. This model is very comprehensive in community services sector. So the 5 steps are defining the issue dilemma. You look at the parameters as well associated with the dilemma. You do the mapping, you identify the stakeholders, and the stakeholders can be clients, organization, other agencies, members of the public, governmental bodies, any external bodies, or any internal bodies as well. And you identify the decision-making makers. You gather information in stage 3. You look at policies and procedures. You look at protocols. You also look at past precedent cases as well. And then in stage 4, you start looking at the options. So once you examine the options, you also start prioritizing as well. And there are methods as well that you can use to determine the hierarchy. And then you apply that to ethical theories and any moral framework. And this could be the organizational theories and associated framework. And the last step is to look at the application, the knowledge gained from the application, and the impact it has on yourself and the practice of the organization. This model is extensively used in community services, social work, and it is very popular here in Australia. As it allows us to facilitate the collection of information, looking at the stakeholders, looking at other indicators, policies and procedures, past cases as well, which may have set a precedent, and impact on ourselves and the organization. So this model helps you with a procedural objectivity. It also helps you with ethical analysis. It also helps you with justification of decision. But remember, as I said, they may not always provide you with a clear answer to a dilemma. Now, I'm going to introduce other frameworks as well that'll help your perspective around ethical decision-making process, ethics as well, methodologies, and a process used by ethicists to look at decision-making process. So the next one is the Australian Productivity Commission's decision-making process. They have a 4-step model, and the model looks at obtaining relevant information, consultation with legislation, guidance, policies, and examining those relevant legislations, guidance, and policies, identifying rights and responsibilities associated with the stakeholders. You also identify the agency policy as well. And similar to Chenoweth's and McAuliffe's decision-making process, you also identify any precedent decisions as well, which one needs to consult agency records, perhaps databases as well. The Next step is to consult your peers, your colleagues, and also your supervisor as well. And then you examine options based on all the above. You identify the possible consequences of each options, including risks associated, and then decide and act and record. They've also placed emphasis on recording the decision-making process in order for you to be able to explain the rationale behind your decision. Another model of decision-making process is Corey and Callahan's 8-step model. This is widely seen in Australia as a client-centered ethical decision-making process. This model focuses on collaborative solutions with the client as well. The 8 steps are identifying the problem or dilemma, step 1. Step 2, you're looking at the nature of the potential issues. You're applying relevant code of ethics, any relevant code of ethics. You consider also relevant law associated with the region that you work. You seek consultation from more than one source, and this could include peers, supervisors, managers, anyone who's experienced a similar dilemma. And then stage 6, you reflect on various course of actions and also on consequences as well. Once you've done that, you evaluate the chosen course of action and you implement your chosen course of action. Now, the next model we're going to look at is Georgina Hawley's 3-stage framework. The 3 stages here consist on communication, understanding, and reflection. Hawley has based this on her personal evolution as well. She was a psychologist, and she is a psychologist, sorry. And she defines her personal evolution when she applied this process, and a belief that that a client collaboration is extremely important when you are making an ethical decision-making process. So the next model that looks at we look at is Crane and Matten's framework. Crane and Matten have highlighted 2 categories, the situational and individual. So they have highlighted four phases in decision-making process. 1, recognizing a moral issue, making a moral judgment, establishing a moral intent, and engaging in moral behavior. But their framework looks at both individual and situational factors that may impact on the decision-making process. Now, individual factors are my own values, beliefs, biases that I may bring in. Situational factors can also be associated with governmental policies, rigidity of the system, any other external factors associated with the dilemma. So what I would advise you when you make appropriate decision is that you seek guidance from your supervisor, You take time to prepare, assess, decide, implement, and reflect on the decision. I also advise you to keep a clear record as well of the decision-making process, just in case you need to justify why you have decided to take that course of action. So it's important that you get supervision. It's important that you consult supervisor, and it's also important that you maintain a record. Australian courts have always emphasized on keeping clear records. In community services, when it becomes your word against the client, it's always best to have um, a backup, that is your case record. I advise you to look at ethical dilemmas that you may have experienced as well, in your personal life, and consider, any particular model that you've looked at, and whether it appeals to your way of thinking. Apply the ethical dilemma to a model, and while you're applying, you may reflect on why you chose that course of action. Was it challenging for you to apply that model? Yep. And when you experiment with a decision-making model, you'll be able to come with your own framework as well in decision-making process. I also advise you to gain substantial knowledge of Aqua Code of Ethics. It's uploaded on the portal. Just go through that. You'll be using it for your assignments as well. I also advise you to go through the ASW Code of Ethics. Continue to reflect on various ethical principles and ethical viewpoints that we discuss during this term. I also advise you to gain a clear understanding of ethical theories, which we discussed last week. Also advise you to continue to maintain ongoing professional development training and gain regular supervision. And lastly, your experience as well. As you move forward in your community service work, you'll have to deal with ethical dilemmas, and you'll have a basis and grounding as well in the complexity of ethics. You'll also find a framework that suits your professional criteria, professional role as well. And remember, an ethical dilemma exists when there's a conflict between rights of views, rights of values of the people involved in the situation. So ethical dilemma also result in conflicting moral claims and can be a precursor to disagreements about important course of action. Now, as part of your tutorial activity, you might want to reflect on an ethical dilemma that you may have experienced at work. So it could be something as simple as you trying to influence client to a set of values. If you did that, you might want to write down in what circumstances you did that. Or another question might be as simple as if you noticed a client involved in a self-destructive behavior, would you express your concerns? If you did, how would you do it? So in relation to those dilemmas that I've given you, or any other dilemmas that you'd like to choose, you identify your own personal values in relation to that ethical dilemma at work. You may also wish to identify societal values relevant to the decision made, and also identify the professional values and ethics. So the materials are all available in your week 1 section of the portal. And in tutorials, you might want to discuss this with your lecturer, what you can do to minimize conflict as well between personal, social, and professional values. And once you've done that, you could also discuss, with your lecturer, what are the ethical options you could take and what might be the best for the client's right and welfare, and what alternative action will protect the great extent possible the social rights we have here, social rights and interests we have here. It could also reflect on the non-maleficence or the least harm an action might cause, and remaining questions around what are the actions are considered effective, efficient, and ethical, and have you looked at both the short-term and long-term consequences.